The Navy told the men who reported to USS Alaska that they were serving in the most capable surface combatant the United States had ever put to sea. That was the institutional position, and it had a foundation in fact. At the time of her commissioning in June 1944, Alaska was larger than any heavy cruiser in the American fleet, faster than any ship in her weight class, and armed with 9 12-inch guns that could reach a target 15 miles away and deliver a shell weighing over 1,000 pounds at a velocity sufficient to penetrate the armor of any cruiser afloat. The men who were assigned to her were told they were the crew of an unprecedented warship, a vessel that represented 6 years of design evolution and the specific solution to a strategic problem that no other ship in the fleet had been built to address. They were told they served something genuinely new. What the commissioning materials did not tell them was that the strategic problem Alaska had been designed to solve, the Japanese cruiser killer that American intelligence had been warning about since 1938, had never been built. The 12-inch guns that were the ship's reason for existence would fire at Japanese positions on beaches. The kamikazes that would threaten the ship were not the enemy cruisers the main battery had been designed to defeat. The mission that occupied Alaska's entire wartime career was not the mission the Navy had spent 6 years and many millions of dollars designing her to perform. She was a carrier escort, an anti-aircraft platform, a shore bombardment vessel. In these roles she was capable and effective. None of them required the main battery that defined her. The men who served aboard Alaska lived inside this gap between design purpose and operational reality for the duration of the war. They also lived inside a hull 27,500 tons at standard load, 310 meters from bow to stern, crewed by a complement that grew from the design number of 2,250 men to something considerably larger as the anti-aircraft augmentations that the kamikaze campaign demanded added personnel to every available space on the ship. That is where the accounting of what Alaska's service actually felt like begins, not in the strategic calculus of whether she was a large cruiser or a battle cruiser. In the specific physical experience of 2,200 men living and working inside a warship specifically designed to carry 9 12-inch guns through waters where Japanese aircraft were specifically designed to sink it. Begin with the ship, because Alaska's architecture was the architecture of a warship that had been designed primarily around its weapons, its speed, and its protection, with the human accommodation that remained after those priorities had been satisfied. This is the design logic of every warship ever built. The difference on Alaska compared to a heavy cruiser or a destroyer was that the greater displacement and the greater length gave the architects more space to work with, and more space allowed more adequate human accommodation in absolute terms, while the pressure of wartime expansion and the kamikaze campaign's demand for additional anti-aircraft personnel converted much of that additional space into additional berthing that reduced the per-man allocation back toward the margins that the smaller ships provided. Alaska's designed berthing was organized on the same tiered bunk system that the entire American Navy used throughout the war. Welded steel pipe frames carrying canvas stretched across them, 3 tiers high, arranged in the lower decks, and the spaces between the engineering compartments that the ship's interior volume permitted. At the designed complement of 2,250 men, this arrangement provided 1 bunk per man, which distinguished Alaska from the destroyers and smaller combatants where hot bunking was standard. The distinction was real and meaningful. It did not mean that sleeping on Alaska was comfortable, but it meant that each man had a specific place to go when his watch ended, a specific horizontal surface designated as his, that was not already warm from another man's body when he arrived. By the time Alaska was operating in the Western Pacific in 1944 and 45, the anti-aircraft expansion had increased her effective complement significantly above the design number. The addition of 40mm and 20mm gun crews, additional fire control personnel, communications ratings to manage the expanded tactical environment of carrier task force operations, and the various support personnel that wartime expansion generated consistently across every warship class, had pushed the total number of men aboard into the low 2,000s on some operations. The specific bunk allocation that had existed in the designed complement did not fully survive this expansion. Men doubled up in spaces intended for fewer occupants, and the distinction between Alaska and the smaller ships narrowed. The interior temperature was the constant physical reality against which everything else that happened aboard Alaska must be measured. The Western Pacific in the summer and fall of 1944 and 45 generated ambient temperatures between 85 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface, with humidity consistently above 75%. These temperatures and humidity levels were the starting point for the ship's interior spaces, not the ceiling. Every space that contained machinery added heat from that machinery to the ambient thermal environment. The engineering plant, the electrical systems, the radar electronics, the anti-aircraft gun mounts and their electrical drive systems, the galley, the laundry, the ventilation system motors, the hundreds of auxiliary systems that a 27,000-ton warship carries in continuous operation, all contributed to the thermal load of the enclosed interior. The lower berthing compartments, surrounded by machinery on most sides and below the waterline, where ventilation was most limited, reached temperatures between 95 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit during operations in tropical waters. This was the temperature at which men who had just completed a 4-hour watch in the gun mounts or the engine room returned to sleep. The ventilation system moved air through these spaces, and the air it moved had already been warmed by the engineering plant before it reached the berthing areas. Sleeping in a berthing compartment on Alaska in August 1944 was sleeping in a space that the ambient conditions made between 10 and 15 degrees hotter than the outside air. In a canvas bunk with no natural airflow, after a 4-hour watch that had itself been conducted in similar or worse conditions, depending on where the watch station was. The gun mounts, which is where the largest proportion of Alaska's expanded crew worked during action, were specific environments that combined the heat problem with the noise problem and the concussion problem in ways that the personnel who served in them consistently described as the most physically demanding aspect of the service. Alaska's secondary battery consisted of 12 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in 6 twin mounts, 3 per side, positioned to provide maximum anti-aircraft coverage across all quadrants. In the anti-aircraft escort role that occupied most of Alaska's wartime service, these guns were the ship's primary weapons. They fired a 53-pound projectile to a maximum altitude of approximately 37,000 feet, at a designed rate of 15 rounds per minute per gun, meaning each twin mount could put 30 rounds per minute into the sky when operated at maximum rate by a properly trained crew in ideal conditions. Ideal conditions were not the conditions of the Western Pacific in 1944 and 45. The 5-inch gun crews who worked the secondary battery during the kamikaze attacks that the Okinawa campaign generated in sustained concentrated form from April through June 1945, worked in mounts where the firing temperature, the blast overpressure from adjacent mounts, the physical demands of ammunition handling at maximum rate, and the sustained alertness that the kamikaze threat required across watches that extended well beyond the normal 4-hour rotation, all converged into a specific form of physical and neurological demand. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun, when fired, produced a muzzle blast overpressure at the positions adjacent to the breech that the mount's configuration placed the loaders and fuse setters in close proximity to. At the sustained firing rates that kamikaze defense required, this overpressure accumulated in the bodies of the men in the mount, not as a single injury event, but as a sustained low-level concussive exposure that the medical literature of the era was beginning to document as producing cumulative neurological effects distinct from individual blast injury. The gunners who loaded the 5-inch mount through 50 or 100 or 200 rounds of sustained firing in a kamikaze defense were experiencing this accumulation in real time, managing it through training and the specific focused attention that immediate mortal threat generates in people who have trained for it, and carrying its residual effects into the watch that followed and the sleep that followed the watch. The noise in and around the 5-inch mounts during sustained anti-aircraft fire was measured in an era before the specific understanding of acoustic trauma had produced the protective standards that later generations would apply to military noise environments. The 5-inch 38 produced a muzzle blast in the range of 150 decibels at the adjacent positions. Prolonged exposure at this level produces measurable hearing damage within minutes. The gun crews of Alaska's secondary battery worked these mounts without effective hearing protection throughout the ship's operational career because the tactical communication requirement made wearing ear protection that blocked human voice frequencies operationally unacceptable. You had to be able to hear the fire control orders. You had to be able to hear the reports from adjacent crew members about ammunition supply and mechanical status. You wore your ears until the war ended and you took home what the war had left of them. The 40mm Bofors guns that supplemented the 5-inch battery against low-flying targets added their own acoustic profile to the same men who were often located adjacent to both weapon systems. The 40mm produced a different frequency signature from the 5-inch, a higher-pitched rapid percussion rather than the concussive single-round blast of the larger caliber. And the combination of both systems firing simultaneously during a coordinated kamikaze attack produced a composite noise environment that no training exercise had replicated at full scale. The numbers that establish what Alaska's specific operational experience actually demanded from her crew require their examination here, because they reveal the gap between the ship's design role and her actual role with the same precision that similar numbers have revealed similar gaps in every other script in this project. Alaska entered the Pacific Combat Zone in January 1945, assigned to Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force operating under Admiral Mark Mitcher. Between January and August 1945, she participated in strikes against Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the Japanese home islands, and the sustained carrier operations that marked the final campaign against Japan. In this period, she participated in screen operations during hundreds of individual air attacks against the task force and fired her 5-inch battery and anti-aircraft defense on multiple separate occasions. Her 12-inch main battery fired in shore bombardment at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, depositing shells against island positions in support of the marine assaults. The 12-inch guns were used so rarely in their intended anti-surface role that the number of rounds fired at sea surface targets during Alaska's entire combat career can be counted in double digits. The weapon that defined the ship, that had driven 6 years of design argument and hundreds of design iterations, and had required the development of an entirely new gun caliber from scratch, fired at beaches. The kamikaze campaign that the Okinawa operation generated was the defining tactical environment of Alaska's Pacific Service, and the experience that placed the greatest sustained demand on the crew in the specific form that the kamikaze's specific operational character produced. The Japanese kamikaze, unlike conventional aircraft attack, was not a threat that peaked in intensity over a short period and then withdrew. It was sustained across weeks and months, arriving in coordinated mass attacks called kikusui operations, but also in constant dribbling individual and small group attacks between the mass efforts, requiring the defensive screens around the carrier task forces to maintain action and readiness continuously, rather than cycling through the alert and secure pattern that conventional air attack had permitted. A task force defending against kamikazes in the Okinawa campaign was a task force whose crews were at action stations, or close to action stations for extended periods with relief available only in the intervals between attacks, and those intervals were not reliable. The men who stood the gun watches on Alaska through the Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945 maintained this sustained alert over a period of approximately 73 days, during which Japanese aircraft sank 26 American ships and damaged over 200 more in the waters around Okinawa. Alaska herself was not hit by a kamikaze during this period, which is a statement about the effectiveness of her defensive fire and the ship handling of her commanding officer, and not a statement about the risk her crew understood themselves to be accepting on each day of the campaign. The specific action that most clearly illustrates what Alaska's service demanded of its crew came not from a combat engagement, but from a rescue and escort operation that is documented in the ship's war diary and in the accounts of her crew members, with a consistency suggesting it was the moment the men themselves identified as the defining event of their service. On March 19, 1945, USS Franklin, an Essex-class carrier operating off the Japanese coast, was struck by 2 bombs dropped by a Japanese aircraft that had penetrated the combat air patrol and dove through the cloud cover before it could be engaged. The 2 bombs struck Franklin's flight deck while she had fully armed and fueled aircraft spotted for launch, triggering a series of explosions and fires that, within minutes, had killed over 700 men and left the ship listing, ablaze, and apparently beyond saving. Franklin did not sink. Her damage control crews fought fires that the explosions had spread across multiple deck levels through a sustained effort of hours that became one of the most celebrated damage control actions in American naval history. By early afternoon, the fires were under control, and Franklin was capable of movement under her own power, but barely. She was in waters where Japanese aircraft were still operating, where Japanese submarines were active, and where the nearest friendly port was thousands of miles away. Alaska was assigned as one of the principal escorts for the damaged carrier's withdrawal. For the next several days, she screened Franklin as the carrier made her slow way toward Ulithi Atoll and eventually to Pearl Harbor, and then the United States for repairs. During this withdrawal, Alaska's anti-aircraft battery covered the damaged carrier against Japanese air attacks, attempting to finish what the bombs had started. The men who worked those gun mounts during Franklin's withdrawal knew what they were protecting. They had seen Franklin burning on the horizon on the morning of the 19th. They knew what 700 dead looked like as a column of smoke, and what it meant to be the screen between a crippled ship full of burned and wounded men and the aircraft trying to reach her. The operational tempo that Alaska sustained through her Pacific service imposed the specific physical demands on her crew that sustained high-intensity naval operations always impose, compounded by the specific size of the ship and what that size added and subtracted from the experience relative to smaller combatants. The watch rotation was 4 hours on, 8 hours off, in the theoretical configuration. The theoretical configuration was not reliably provided during sustained operations because the kamikaze campaign's requirement for continuous high-state readiness regularly compressed the off-watch period in ways the rotation schedule did not anticipate. Action stations overrode the rotation. General quarters could be called at any hour, and in the Okinawa campaign, General Quarters was called with a frequency that the 8-hour off-watch period could not reliably accommodate between alarms. A gun crew member who had completed a 4-hour watch, returned to his berthing space, and been awakened by General Quarters 2 hours later, was a gun crew member operating on 2 hours of sleep, trying to manage the physical and cognitive demands of anti-aircraft fire direction in a high-threat environment. This was not the exception during the Okinawa campaign, it was the routine. The food on Alaska was, by the standard measures available, better than the food on destroyers and most cruisers. The larger galley, the larger refrigerated storage, and the greater provisioning capacity that a 27,000-ton ship provided relative to a 3,000-ton destroyer translated into fresher provisions held for longer periods and a wider variety of prepared meals when the provisions were available. In port, and during the initial days of a deployment from port, fresh meat, fresh bread, and fresh vegetables were available on a schedule that smaller ships could not match. The transition from fresh provisions to preserved rations as the deployment extended was the same transition every ship in the Pacific made. It happened later on Alaska than on destroyers, but it happened, and the canned meat and powdered eggs and dried vegetables that sustained the crew through the later weeks of extended operations were nutritionally adequate and texturally monotonous in the same way they were monotonous on every ship. The scale of the galley operation, feeding over 2,000 men in the watch rotation and sittings that the crew's schedule produced, imposed its own specific form of the food experience. Meals consumed quickly in the specific time window the watch rotation allowed, in a mess environment that the ship's population density made, crowded at every sitting. Fresh water on Alaska was more readily available than on destroyers, which is a statement about relative rather than absolute abundance. The ship's distilling capacity could produce enough fresh water for reasonable personal hygiene at the designed complement under normal operating conditions. The kamikaze campaign's operational demands compressed the time available for personal hygiene in ways that the distilling plant's output could not compensate for. Men who had been at action stations for extended periods and whose off-watch periods were themselves interrupted by alarms did not shower with the frequency that peacetime standards would have required because the watch schedule did not permit it. And this reality was the same reality that every small combatant's crew lived in all the time, and that Alaska's crew encountered specifically during the most intense periods of the Okinawa campaign. The psychological weight of kamikaze defense, specifically and distinctly from the psychological weight of conventional air attack or surface action, created a form of sustained vigilance that the medical literature was beginning to characterize during the war, and that the post-war accounts of Alaska's survivors described with enough consistency to establish it as genuinely characteristic of the service. Conventional aircraft attack was a threat that the trained eye could assess with some predictability. A Japanese torpedo bomber making an attack run produced a specific visual signature: the low approach, the steady course, the moment of release, the turn away. The fighter pilot or gun crew that engaged it was responding to a known threat profile that training had specifically addressed and that experience had refined. The threat peaked and resolved. The aircraft hit or missed or was shot down, and the engagement ended. The kamikaze's specific operational character eliminated the resolution that conventional attack provided. A kamikaze approaching the ship had already resolved its own future. It was not calculating risk and reward in the tactical sense that a live pilot calculating survival odds must calculate them. It was committed. This commitment produced an approach profile that the gun crews defending against it experienced as specifically different from conventional attack in the quality of the threat it presented. The kamikaze that was hit did not turn away. It kept coming, in some cases controlling its flight with a damaged aircraft and adjusting its aim until the structural damage from the defensive fire was sufficient to prevent it from reaching the ship at all, or until it struck. The gun crew shooting at a kamikaze was not shooting at a pilot who was weighing his options. It was shooting at a decision that had already been made. This knowledge, universally understood by the crews of every ship in the Okinawa screen from April through June 1945, produced the specific psychological environment of those weeks. You could engage a conventional attacker and assess whether you had deterred it. You could not deter a kamikaze. You could only destroy it before it arrived. One of the men who stood gun watch on Alaska through the Okinawa campaign and the Franklin escort was gunner's mate 3rd Class William Harmon of Albany, New York, who served as a pointer on one of Alaska's twin 5-inch mounts from the ship's commissioning in June 1944 through her deployment to the Pacific in January 1945 and through the entire Okinawa campaign. Harmon was 22 years old when he commissioned Alaska. He had completed gunner's mate training at Great Lakes and had specifically requested assignment to Alaska after reading the Navy's press release about her commissioning, which described the ship in terms that the press release's function required and that bore the specific relationship to operational reality that all such materials bear. He stood his watches at the gun mount's pointer position through the Iwo Jima operations and through the strikes on the Japanese home islands in February and March 1945. He was at his station during the Franklin rescue and escort. He was at his station through the Okinawa campaign from its beginning on April 1st, through the Japanese surrender in August. He estimated in a post-war account provided to a Gunner's Mate Veterans Association newsletter in 1968 that he had participated in approximately 40 separate air defense engagements during his service aboard Alaska, ranging from brief single aircraft intercepts to the sustained multi-hour engagements of the large Kikusui operations against the Okinawa screen. He had been at the mount long enough in each of the major engagements that the sustained blast exposure was something he noticed not during the engagements, when the attention the situation demanded left no cognitive space for noticing accumulation, but afterward, in the ringing that remained in his ears after the firing ceased and that declined over the hours following the engagement, but never returned to a baseline he recognized as the baseline from before the previous engagement. He described this accumulating ringing in his 1968 account in terms that the Veterans Administration subsequently classified as service-connected hearing loss, a designation that meant his hearing damage was acknowledged as caused by his service, but not that it was adequately compensated by the compensation structure available. He returned to Albany after the war and worked for 31 years as a machinist at a manufacturing plant near the waterfront. He retired in 1976. He died in 1991 at the age of 69. His daughter, in a brief account provided to an Albany Historical Society oral history project in 2003, described her father as a man whose hearing had been poor her entire life, who had worn hearing aids from his mid-30s onward, and who had never specifically discussed the connection between the hearing aids and the gun mount in any direct terms, though the connection was not difficult to draw. She said he had once described the 5-inch mount's sound during sustained firing to her husband, who had asked about it at a family dinner. He said it was not loud in the way that the word loud conveys something about the world. He said it was loud in the way that the world stops existing outside of the immediate event. He said that every shot was the entire universe for the fraction of a second it occupied, and then the universe came back and the next shot did it again, and the next after that, and so on, for however many rounds the firing lasted. He said after enough of these, the universe coming back, between shots started to sound slightly different from the universe it had been before the first shot, and that this difference accumulated, and that after a certain number of engagements, the universe between shots was just somewhat different than it had been, and it stayed that way. His daughter said her husband had not known what to say to this, and had said something inadequate, as people do when someone describes something precisely, and the precision does not fit any available response. She said her father had nodded and returned to his dinner, and the subject had not come up again. She said the hearing aids were in a box in the closet after he died. She had not known what to do with them and had not thrown them away. They were still there. What would you have found hardest about serving aboard USS Alaska during those final months of the Pacific War? The sustained kamikaze threat, the gun crew's relentless exposure, or simply knowing the weapon the ship was built around was never used for the purpose it was designed for? Let us know below.